George Washington Carver. Rookie Biographies, George Washington Carver by Dana Meechan Rao. Table of Contents. Meet George Washington Carver. George Washington Carver was a trailblazer. When he was growing up, African American people faced unfair treatment. George did not let that stop him from becoming a famous scientist and helping poor farmers. George's love of nature led him to become a scientist. George was born in Missouri around 1864. His mother, Mary, was a slave owned by Mr. and Mrs. Carver. That made George a slave, too. A slave is a person owned by someone else. Slaves were forced to work for no pay. George was born in Diamond, Missouri. Many Southern farmers owned black people as slaves. When George was only a tiny baby, thieves kidnapped him and his mother. Mr. Carver traded a horse to get George back. George's mother was never seen again. Slaves worked in the fields all day for no pay. The Southern Army surrendered to the North to end the Civil War. The Civil War ended when George was just a baby. Now he and his brother Jim were free. Mr. and Mrs. Carver raised them as their sons. George was sickly and could not help with heavy chores, so he helped Mrs. Carver wash laundry and tend the gardens. Fast fact: when neighbors needed help growing their plants, they called on young George. They called him the plant doctor. This photo shows a reproduction of the house George grew up in. A lifetime of learning. George loved to paint. He also enjoyed being outdoors, studying plants and collecting rocks. Mrs. Carver taught George how to read and write. He wanted to learn more, but he was not allowed to go to the nearby school because he was African American. When George was about 12 years old, he heard about a school for black children. It was 8 miles away. He left his family and walked to the distant town. Mr. and Mrs. Watkins let George stay with them. Mrs. Watkins taught George how to use plants for medicine. This photo of George was taken when he was 13 years old. After finishing school, George worked at different jobs. Then he was accepted to a college in Kansas. When George went to the college to meet the president of the college, however, he was turned away. The college would not accept black students. George moved to Iowa and entered art school. George loved to paint pictures of flowers. George was an excellent painter. His teacher knew it would be hard for a black man to get a job as an artist, so she urged George to study agriculture, the science of farming. He was the first African American student to study at Iowa State College. He even became a teacher there. This is a photo of Iowa State College. Professor Carver. People heard about George's work. In 1896, he was invited to be a teacher at the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. Tuskegee was a school for black men and women. George would be the head of the school's agricultural department. He looked forward to helping poor farmers in the South. This photo shows George at work in his lab. Southern farmers grew lots of cotton. Planting cotton year after year was not good for the soil. It took out a lot of the nutrients that help plants grow. George discovered that planting different crops each year made the soil healthy again. George taught his students how to keep farmland healthy. George Washington Carver. George did not just teach the students at Tuskegee. Sometimes he brought the school right to the farmers. He taught farmers which plants were better for the soil. The peanut plant was one example. Peanuts added nutrients to the soil and provided food for a family. George showed farmers the best plants to grow. George also showed people that peanuts, sweet potatoes, soybeans, and pecans were not just for eating. He invented ways to make them into candy, oils, soap, and lots of other useful items. Fast fact, George discovered how to make almost 300 products from peanuts, including cereal, milk, flour, dye, soap, candy, medicine, glue, paint, and gasoline. He also created more than 150 uses for the sweet potato. When George died in 1943, the world lost a great scientist and a great man. Throughout his life, George had shown others the importance of treating all people fairly, no matter what their color. He cared for nature, and he cared for people too. Timeline of George Washington Carver's life. Around 1864, born, exact date not known. Enters Simpson College in 1890 to study art. 1891, enters Iowa State College to study farming. 1896, starts teaching at the Tuskegee Institute. 1943, dies on January 5th. A poem about George Washington Carver. From slave to scientist to teacher of farmers, a hardworking man was George Washington Carver. With potatoes and peanuts, he was quite the magician. He was smart and hardworking with lots of ambition. You can be a trailblazer. Be unique. Find your own talents and discover hobbies you enjoy. Ask yourself questions such as why and how, then seek the answers. Think of how you can help others in a way that has never been done before. How can you be the first at something new? Glossary. Agriculture, farming, nutrients, substances that give plants the food and minerals they need to grow. Slave, someone who is owned by another person and thought of as property. Trailblazer, a person who has new ideas or who does new things that have not been done before. Index. Facts for now. About the author. Dana Meechan Rao has written more than 325 books for children, including lots of nonfiction and early readers. She tends her gardens with her husband and children in Burlington, Connecticut. The end.